You're listening to Seminary Dropout, episode 44, and I'm your host, Shane Blackshear. This week, we'll talk about the Seminary Dropout survey, the Twitter campaign we launched last week, plus an interview with Preston Sprinkle and his new book, Fight, A Christian Case for Nonviolence. All this and more, let's go. Welcome, friends. Thanks, as always, for joining me. I greatly appreciate it. Well, this week I wanted to follow up on the Seminary Dropout survey. We talked a little bit about it last week, and I really don't have a lot more to say about it other than just to remind you that it's there. I'm only going to take 100 people because that's when SurveyMonkey starts charging me money, is when it goes above 100. So I'm going to cap it at 100. And I would greatly appreciate it if you would go there if you haven't yet, fill out that survey. If you're a new listener or if you've been listening for a long time, please, I would ask you to go fill that out. It's only 10 questions, and it really just doesn't take that long. And I'm going to pick 3 people, not just one, not just 2, but 3 people who are going to get a Seminary Dropout t-shirt for free for filling out that survey. So please go do that. It's been really valuable thus far. I want to thank everyone who's already filled it out, and especially the females who have filled it out, because last week I was saying I didn't have good representation, and I don't know if that's just indicative of the show, if there are just that many more male members, or if for some reason the males are taking the survey more than the females. I don't know, but the percentage has gone up a little bit on the female side. We're still overwhelmingly male, and I am working on that. So please go fill that out. I'll remind you that that is there, and I've gotten valuable information, and I've already incorporated some of it. One of the biggest pieces of feedback I got, more than one person said, hey, we'd like to be able to ask questions ourselves to these people, have some listener questions. So I've already incorporated that, and I'll remind you that that's available. Everyone who I've booked thus far, who's for sure on the calendar, is listed over at shaneblackshear.com/guests. And that's always going to be a fresh page, meaning I'm not going to post a new blog post every time I have a new guest. You can just always go to that one, and I'll keep that post updated. So whenever you're hearing this, if you're hearing this at some point in the future, everybody would be hearing it in the future, I would hope. But if you're meaning if it is not July of 2014 for you, at some point in the distant future, you should still be able to go to shaneblackshear.com/guests and see who the upcoming guests are. So go check that out. This last week I had the privilege of interviewing Walter Brueggemann. I mean, one of the most preeminent Old Testament scholars alive today. Had the privilege of talking with him, interviewing him, and asked him about 4 listener questions. So that was really cool to be able to do that, and look for that interview coming up in the next couple of months. So that should be cool. So yes, the survey that came from there. Yeah, next, the contest. Last week I launched a small little contest to give away a DVD of the movie Ragamuffin, which I've reviewed, which last week the interview was with David Leo Schultz, who was the director of Ragamuffin, and it was a really, really good movie. So anyways, I've got a DVD of that, and it can be yours if you will go to that page, and there's rules for the contest. So I'm asking for you to rate, review, and subscribe, and then leave a comment, and that will enter you in the contest. There have not been many entries thus far, so you have a really good chance of winning. So if you've already done those things, then all you need to do is go comment, and so that you enter into the contest. So you got nothing to lose. So I would go ahead and do that. It's a great movie, and it could be yours for free. Okay, the Twitter campaigns. Last week, I launched these Twitter campaigns. This idea that for those people that have been kind of hard to book on the show as guests, Most of the time, they're bigger names, and so it's been kind of hard to get some people's attention. And so I launched this idea of doing a Twitter campaign where we would all, at the same time, tweet to these people and say, "Hey, you should be on Seminary Dropout with Beard on a Bike," which is my Twitter handle. And so last week we chose for the very first campaign Michael Gungor. Here's how that went. Number one, I made a typo, and in the post, which were the show notes for last week's show, I gave a generic tweet for everyone to tweet out. And it was basically what I just said. It was, "Hey, Michael Gungor, you should be on Seminary Dropout with @BeardOnABike." And it was his Twitter name was included in there. Now, I made a typo, and so it said @Bear on a Bike, which is kind of funny. You take one letter out, and it changes it all completely. And so, sorry if @Bear on a Bike, if you're out there, that was probably really confusing. But most people caught the typo and fixed it themselves. So it went out there, and Michael Gungor actually responded. He said, apparently, I should be on Seminary Dropout with @BeardOnABike. Now, I tweeted back to him and said, hey, give me, some kind of contact info so we can make that happen if you want to make that happen. He didn't get back to me. So, I didn't, that was something I didn't anticipate. I either thought we would not get someone's attention or we would, and then we'd be able to book him. So, something kind of in the middle is what happened. So I'm going to say, let's give it one more week. And if it doesn't work, we'll move on to the next person. So if you would do that, and if you didn't do it yet, please do, because it will help. Like I said, it got Michael's attention, and I bet we could book him on the show, and then we could book other people. We can move on and go to other people as well. So if you're interested in hearing Michael Gungor on the show, tweet, "Hey," and his Twitter handle is just @Michael Gungor. You should be on Seminary Dropout with @BeardOnABike. And we'll see if it works. Like I said, we'll give it another week. If you are interested in helping out the show, that's a great way to do it. So send that tweet out. So I'll go ahead and put that copy on the show notes for this show as well. You can copy and paste if you want to. The next thing I want to talk about, I try not to talk about this too much, but have to every once in a while. And that is the idea of putting my virtual tip jar out there. And the thing about this podcast is, when I first started, there was a lot of just investment, I guess I should say, that goes into it. The equipment, things like that. And then there's things that are just maintaining, and things that cost money, like my website, the place where I host my audio files so it doesn't crash when a bunch of people listen to it, and little things here and there. And I'm certainly not making money on this, but I'm also not breaking even at this point. And at this point, it's kind of a thing where it's just nickel and diming me to death. And so, when we started going once a week as opposed to every other week, that the expenses went up because I had to pay more for my subscription service for the site where I host these audio files. And it was only a little bit per month. It wasn't very much at all. But the thing is, those little things, they come here and there. And like I said, it just kind of nickels and dimes me to death. So if I hate asking this, and I don't know a good tactful way. So I've said it before, and I'll say it again. I'll just default to being honest. So think of it this way. Look, I'm not a musician. I'm not a painter. I can't draw. I can't dance. This is the only art I have. And I truly do look at it that way. This is my creative outlet. Making things sound good, asking the best questions I can, and coming in here and doing post-production where I edit it and put in the fade in the music and all that kind of stuff to make it a quality program. This is my art. It's as good as I get. So if you would think of it this way, especially for those who've listened for a long time and would consider yourselves regular listeners, or you check in from time to time when you see someone who's interesting, think of it this way. If you went to a coffee shop to specifically hear a musician who is playing that night, you went there just for that reason, and they had a tip jar, you probably leave a couple bucks there. So I'm going to just ask that you do the same. And literally, please don't think it's too small. If I had $1 for every download that we had, this could be my full-time job overnight. I'm not asking for that much money, but if you could give $1, a couple dollars, $5, just as a one-time gift, or maybe you think, in a given year, an episode is published every week, so I'm probably going to listen to, all of those, half of those, 10 of those. I'll give, $1 for every episode I listen to, or something like that. That'd be greatly appreciated. You can go to seminarydropout.com, click on support. I think it's support, not donate. Yeah, that's right, support. And, just put in a few bucks, $1, whatever you're comfortable with. And listen, if you're unable to do this, then don't even let it bother you. I'm so happy to have you as a listener, and the relationships that I've been able to make, the joy that I get from reading a positive review on iTunes, or knowing that you subscribe and that this is a weekly part of your life, means the world to me. So don't for a second feel bad if you're just completely unable to give anything financially. I totally get it. I've been in that situation before. But if you are able, and you find this valuable, and you've got something out of it, and it's enriched your life, and you've got something that has brought you closer to the Lord, I would greatly appreciate it if you would go and show your support in that way. Okay, I'm going to move on. For those who are listening to the show for the first time, you're probably thinking, geez, that was really heavy-handed. I'm sorry. I'll do that thing that they do in church and say, we're passing the offering plate. If you're a guest, we ask that you not give. I'll say that same thing to you now, and ask that you listen to some more episodes where I don't do what I just did. Okay, I think that's it. I'm going to move on to this interview. I had such a great time listening to this today during post-production. I had such a good time talking with Preston. For those of you who don't know, Preston is a New York Times best-selling co-author. He has a PhD in New Testament from Aberdeen University and is currently teaching at Eternity Bible College in Simi Valley, California, where he lives with his wife and 4 kids. Preston, thank you so much for joining me today at Seminary Dropout.
It's good to be here.
We're here to talk about your book, Fight, a Christian Case for Nonviolence. I think I want to start out talking a little bit about what you didn't talk a whole lot about in the book, which is how you kind of personally came to this conclusion. Yeah. You talk about one of the things that you emphasize is that you come from a pretty conservative background and still are kind of a non-denominational Reformed orientation.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And so I'm going to guess that pacifism and nonviolence was not something that was taught to you growing up in that environment?
No, I only heard the term pacifism. I mean, very rarely. And when I did, it was associated with non-Christianity, hippie liberals that wouldn't know Jesus from a hole in the wall. So it was one of those things growing up where it was never even considered. It was like I wouldn't consider, Satanism. I wouldn't consider, Islam. I'm a Christian, and pacifism would be something else that I just wasn't on the table for discussion. But I would say throughout my theological journey, really my main goal in life and as a Christian educator is to ask the question, does the Bible actually say ... This is what we've grown up with. And there's times when it does. There's times when it's like, yeah, my Sunday school teacher is actually spot on, but there's other times when it's like, wow, I grew up with this belief, but I don't, as I study the Bible, I just don't see it being justified. So that's been throughout my theological journey, how I treat all topics. And it was 2007, 2008, when I was teaching a class on ethics and warfare and violence was one of the questions that we wrestled with. And I said, well, hey, here's a good time to wrestle with this violence question and just lay it out. And I was shocked at how at that time, how much the Bible has to say about nonviolence. It wasn't like an overnight, totally, slam dunk for me. I was like, but wow, how come I have not heard that. How come this has not been taught? How come this has not been wrestled with? How come conservative Bible believing evangelicals, how come there's not like a 50-50 split? Because
Mm.
I'm looking at passages and I could argue both pretty well. In fact, I could probably argue better for the nonviolent position. And that's what got the ball rolling. And the more I talked, the more I read, the more I interacted, the more I thought through things. And I like to, I always, if I'm going to kind of switch positions, I want to know what are the main arguments? What are the arguments against that position? What are the main arguments against that position? And if I could sort of answer those, then I feel like that's a good way to kind of say, well, maybe that position is actually correct. And after a while, the more after a while, you're right, you start to read the same things over and over. And well, Romans 13, no, Romans 13 actually. And well, what do you do with the Book of Revelation? I'm like, well, everybody's dying in the Book of Revelation. I mean, so I kept seeing not only the same arguments against the nonviolent position, but I mean, quite honestly, for the most part, I'm not going to say this for every argument, for the most part, they were really poor arguments. Quite honestly, they were just people citing passages without really knowing what it's saying in much detail. For the most part, so that was it. So I said, I want to write a book on this and kind of just sum up all my thoughts, and that's what led to Fight. And after researching and writing Fight, it just it made my view even stronger, I think.
I think much in the same way when we read some things in the Bible, or even just some things outside the Bible from that time period, and we have a hard time understanding their cultural hangups.
Yeah.
Part of me wonders that if 500 years from now, people are listening to this interview or reading your book, if they're wondering why this is so hard for us, meaning why we are so why we're such outsiders in our faith for believing in this. And so I want to talk a little bit about just that kind of phenomenon of it being anathema of believing in nonviolence as a Christian living in 2014.
Yeah, I think you're dead on there. I mean, I think it's really a short span of time, what, 50, 80 years maybe, where Christian and nonviolence were kind of incompatible. I mean, obviously it goes back to 70s and 80s, especially Cold War era, the sort of Reagan in bed with the Christian right and everything. And it's very easy if you look back at history to see where that came in, and that's where a lot of our upbringing, maybe not your specific upbringing, but our generation, our parents were forged in that. Of course they're gonna, the whole Red Scare and the atheistic commies and the Christian America. And so I can look back and it's almost like I can cut them some slack. I'm like, okay, I could see where that blind spot formed, but we're racing out of that. I mean, now on a very secular level, there's such a jaded feeling towards war and military. I mean, I think post 9/11 that shift is gonna. It may take a while, but I think that I think it's gonna be much easier for Christians to consider nonviolence, even if they, like me, if they don't have that tradition. And I think in 50 years they're gonna look back and I think I don't know if I'd equate it quite to like slavery, where we look back and you'd find very few Christians that would say, yeah, totally, slavery makes sense. I don't know if it would be that uniform, as long as we still are Christians living in a country that is established and guarded and can only continue with a raging military machine. Like as much as there's kind of pushback to that ideology, I feel like as long as the ideology is still there, it's going to be hard for this to be majority. But I do think we are moving fast towards. I mean, again, I don't want to ramble too much, but I'm seeing absolute nonviolence on an individual level. That's still hard for a lot of people to buy into. In my circles, the sort of anti-patriotic gospel, anti-militaristic, the kind of the 30,000 foot, let's dominate by power and force. I know tons of people who would not call themselves pacifist who agree with me on that. Really, I know so many people that say 95% of the book I totally am with you with. But I'm still shooting the guy that breaks into my door. I'm like, okay, if that ever happens, since that happens, I'll
Right.
So I absolute nonviolence. I don't, that may be a hard position for a lot of people to buy. But in a sense, to me, the bigger issue is that militaristic spirit. the Veterans Day parades inside churches, and just that marriage between that syncretism. I see that falling aside very quickly and very thoroughly. I hope, at least.
Yeah, I think that our generation, even if people in our generation of believers are not pacifists, see much more clearly how ugly that marriage that you're talking about is. And so even if they're not, strict pacifists, they see that it's gotten out
Yeah.
of hand, our blending together of those two things for sure.
Yeah.
One of the things that I kept thinking when I was reading your book, and you make clear, one, and I kind of touched on this earlier, that you consider yourself a conservative. And I myself and a lot of people that I talk to on the show come from kind of more of a centrist background, Anabaptist, that kind of thing, third way. One of the things that I kept thinking when I was reading the book is, man, how much do your colleagues hate you?
Well, honestly, I've been blessed. Again, it may be different in Southern California. I mean, I would say my colleagues at school, the only difference between me and them is that I've studied it out and I can kind of say confidently, this is where I stand. I think of the 13 different teachers I'm with, faculty, admin, they again would agree with the 95%, and some of them would probably agree with the other 5%. They just haven't had the time to kind of work through it, so they don't vocal. So no, there is hands down my board of directors, or the board of trustees with the school. I mean, these are a bunch of old businessmen. They love it. They so I am in a slightly different culture. It is theological. I don't even like the term conservative really, because the
Sure,
conservative
it's
liberal
loaded.
thing, for the sake of I mean, most people out there would probably consider most of my beliefs conservative. But yeah, I'm blessed by a community that is truly trying to be biblical. And so if I argue from the text for whatever, they're like, hey, if the Bible says it, then we got to go with it. So, and even my church too. Like I'm an elder at my church, and I would say probably most, if not all of them, this would not be their default answer, but most have read the book. They promote it. They sell it we sell like 5 books on our book table, and this is one of them. And there's some people in the church like, what's with that nonviolent, but it's not really. I'm blessed by a very gospel-centered community that doesn't let these sort of issues that are kind of new or foreign. They ask the question, is it well, what would Jesus say? Like, do they genuinely
Yeah.
want that? So yeah, no, it's yeah, there's been total excitement about it. Yeah.
Good. Well, and obviously, I was speaking a little bit of hyperbole when I asked that question. But I'm glad that that's there, and I hope that spreads too. The next thing that I wanted to talk about was part of why I think that this is so important, because I've thought this for a while, that the outside world, I've had this theory that the outside world would respect Christianity and Christians more if we were just consistent with our beliefs.
Absolutely.
So we speak out vehemently against abortion and that kind of thing, but we're all very, very silent, or even pro capital punishment sometimes, and come across very bloodthirsty in war a lot of times. And I feel like the outside world sees that as is very hypocritical, and personally, I think rightly so.
Right.
And so when we present something that is at least consistent, the outside world may not agree with that, but they would at least say that, hey, these people are being consistent. They're being true to what they say they believe. Whereas kind of what we do now looks very much like just taking sides on a culture war. Does that make sense?
No, yeah. No, I agree. I think even statistically, that's been shown, that the inconsistency of what we say and what we do, or even just what we believe here and what we believe here. I think I think the outside world, because the outside world, especially in America, most of them grew up in the church, so they have firsthand experience with people that said this but then did this. So yeah, I mean absolutely. I think. I mean, what if, right? If the Christian church, the American Christian church, was known for being nonviolent because their Lord was nonviolent, and it makes no sense humanly speaking, but through the resurrection, it makes sense. It makes all the sense in the world. And more than that, it was demonstrated by their Savior, and so we're going to do it. I mean, if that was a narrative that we promoted, maybe not unanimously, but widespread, I think the outside world, I think they would see that as, wow, yeah, at least you guys actually do follow your Jesus, like,
Yeah.
because when people read the New Testament, when an unbeliever with no baggage reads the Gospels, right? I mean, I think statistically they walk away saying, yeah, oh, of course he's nonviolent. Like, it's not, there's
Yeah.
no debate. They don't go to like, well, the cleansing of the temple, or they don't. It's like, look at him, like he's not acting in violence when he very well should have and could have. So yeah, I think that would be huge for getting a good name of the church.
Okay, so let's get into the actual content of the book.
Sure, yeah.
You're very, very thorough, and very, very biblical. And so I just want to kind of touch on some of those, tip of the icebergs that you wrestle with in the book. First, the big challenge that people bring up is the idea of violence in the Old Testament. What do we do with violence in the Old Testament, and especially when it looks to be God ordained violence in the Old Testament?
Yeah, there's a few. We have to, when people ask that question, what do you do? It's usually framed in, what do you do with the Old Testament? And I say, well, let's narrow down a specific question. The specific question is, what does the violence in the Old Testament do for a Christian ethic? Like, we need to narrow that down. Like what? There's violence in the Old Testament, yes, but is that giving an authoritative ethic for believers following Jesus in the New Testament to therefore use violence? Like it needs to be really specific. And then they're going to say, well, I think most people are like, okay, well, maybe not. And then I also want to break down the, as I say in the book, the is and the ought. There's violence that existed in the Old Testament. Everybody's and then there's the ought, the violence that God may have ordained, commanded, allowed, sanctioned for the time, whatever. And so we need to ask questions to really break down what exactly is it that we're talking about. Now, some of my Mennonite friends, they didn't really love my section on the Old Testament, because I did say, no, God commanded violence in the Old, and it's just it was for that time, and it's hard for me to get around that. I've seen attempts to get around it. I just wasn't convinced of it. I would rather sit with the tension than, say, as one of the guys said, well, maybe Moses misunderstood God's command. God didn't really want them to annihilate everybody. And I'm like, well, I hope so, but I have textual.
You have to read that into the text to get that.
I throw my exegesis out the window and just go on what may have happened behind it, and I'm just not comfortable with that. But the two things I did see clearly in the text, I was just talking about this yesterday, is even though there is violence commanded by God, there is still an anti-militaristic thread throughout. And again, that's kind of if you want to take my main point of the book, is Christians should not put faith in military might. And we see that even in especially in the Old Testament, where God wanted them to have, no standing army, a weak military, a king that wasn't a military. It was very anti-militaristic so that God could miraculously do this, So I think that's actually very significant. So it's not violence, no violence. There's more at work. What's the spirit of the Old Testament? The spirit is through and through anti-militaristic. Don't have a big military machine to conquer evil. So that's one. And then two, as I said in the book, you do definitely see what I would say is violence being tolerated in the Old Testament. It's commanded even sometimes, but a movement away from violence to nonviolence in the prophets. And I kind of piggyback on how Old Testament scholars handle other ethical questions like slavery and polygamy, the treatment of women, divorce, which I think that one's an easy one, because Jesus explicitly says God allowed that back then, doesn't allow that now, and I would say that violence is very much the same. Yes, God used that for a period of time while he was, in charge of this nation state, Israel, and, but even within the Old Testament, you see a movement away from that. So, yeah.
And so a lot of what you deal with is this kind of hermeneutic of what is a lot of times being called reading the scriptures redemptively.
Yeah, yeah.
And so it's this idea, and I think his name's Bill Webb touches on this a lot in his great book, Slaves, Women, and Homosexuals. This idea that God is continuously throughout time, we see this in the Old Testament, pulling people towards his ideal, his greater ideal. And for a time, he deals with people on their own terms and even acquiesces to some things that is not his greatest ideal, simply to have a relationship with human beings. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
And so that makes a lot of sense of the things that we see in the Old Testament.
Yeah.
And even the most strident conservative who thinks we should still live by the law of the Old Testament is probably not stoning their children for disobeying them.
Right. Yeah.
And so there's a hint there that something has changed, that God is pulling us toward us. That's hard for us, don't you think, that grew up in a very conservative church? I did as well, because we were taught that God does not change. And so by extension, we kind of feel like God's rules, what is permissible, also doesn't change. So that's kind of hard for us.
I hear that all the time, and it really breaks down. I mean, it's an assumption that if somebody's rules change, then their characters change. But I use the analogy of, if my 11-year-old daughter, jumped in my car and took it for a spin right now, she's gonna be grounded for a month. Like, that's just so not allowed. But when she's 20 and she grabs my keys, jumps in the car, it's gonna be like, hey, you know what? Next time, why don't you ask? But hey, that's cool. Like it's
right.
It's like, wait a minute, is your character change? Well, no. That as people, and the Bible even uses the metaphor of maturity in Galatians 3. That the new covenant is. I have friends that would totally disagree with this, but an improvement on or drawing out the best of the old, and that people of God did go through a period of time where they needed this sort of law, and now they moved away from that, or not. And again, not doing away with the law, but bringing it to its climax, bringing out the full intention of the law. So anyway, that just because rules change doesn't mean the character changes. And this is the thing that. It's like, as you said, I mean, the dietary laws, the sewing fabric together. I mean, all these things, like, everybody has to deal with it, with not even with violence, but with all sorts of. We all as Christians believe that God's rules have changed. Like, we didn't go to church with a lamb on our shoulder last Sunday. So it's kind of the obvious point that people kind of ignore when they talk about violence. But then when you open it up to the whole of Scripture and all these other issues, like, oh yeah, okay, I guess I do have to deal with that, regardless of the question of violence.
Yeah, one of the things that you pointed out that I had never realized was that Israel never has a professional military, which is crazy.
Yeah.
So they're like part-time. They're like volunteers, basically.
Weekend warriors. Yeah, we were just in class yesterday. We're talking about, in Old Testament backgrounds, we're talking about Assyria and how Assyria had they sort of invented this idea of having a standing army, and that's how they dominated the world. And everybody else since Assyria kind of picked up on that. If you're going to dominate the world, you got to have an aggressive professional military, and it's in that sort of context that you have Deuteronomy 20, the worst battle plan in the history of the ancient Near East. You have a bunch of weakened warriors, but they're not allowed to use weapons, like no horses, no chariots. It's like, like today it would be like saying, let's pick a bunch of people that don't have any fighting skills. Anybody that's scared, they can kind of stay home, or if they got married, stay home. And make sure you don't bring any high-powered weapons. Bring your slingshots, and then go into battle. It's like, to make sure that if they win, it's clearly God. Have a very weak military. Assyria, they don't have a God like me, right? So they need this big, strong army, and I'm going to destroy them too. So I want you to have a weak military so that people will know that it's God fighting your battle. So again, you have violence, yes. Militarism, absolutely no. It's anti-militaristic.
I was so struck by the words when the rules are being laid down for, you just mentioned it, for who's going to be a part of the army. And it's if you just built a house, go home so you can enjoy the house. You just got married, I think was one.
For a year,
The last one is almost comical because it's like, if you are faint of heart or fearful, it's almost like, also if you just don't want to, that's also go home.
Which if you're in Assyria reading that passage, you're scratching your head thinking, what, you're not allowed, you can just go home if you like, that doesn't make, like, well, they're not going to win any battles. And God's like, exactly, they won't win any battles unless I miraculously, do it for them.
Yeah, it just struck me how just completely bizarre on any kind of a tactical, strategical sense it
Yeah.
was that they were doing it. And so it's very obvious.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's move to the New Testament. What specifically, what specifically does Jesus say
Yeah.
about violence or nonviolence?
Yeah. There's the obvious one is the Sermon on the Mount, and I definitely spend time there. But I didn't want that to be. Well, it is. I mean, according to Jesus, it's a really important passage. But I wanted to get a lot of other things. And basically, whenever the topic of violence comes up quite a bit. Sometimes it's retaliation, sometimes it's responding to oppression. There's different subcategories of the type of violence, but whenever violence is mentioned, or when it's directed at Jesus, he never responds in violence. He always teaches a nonviolent posture. And I don't think any one passage would do it. I mean, you could take Matthew 5 and say, well, it's only about retaliation. He's not talking about defending an innocent person. And I'm like, okay, I'll give you that. I'm not convinced of that, but I'll give you that. But when you add up everything else, first century Rome, very violent culture. Jesus talks about violence a lot. Never, ever, ever does he suggest a hint that violence could be used in defense of the innocent. Whenever he faced violence, he responded nonviolently. More than that, when the apostles look at the life of Christ, I think this is the most important point made by Yoder and others, that when the apostles look at Jesus, they rarely said, what would Jesus do, except for violence. Except for responding to evil. And, they did, Paul, in his discussion on being single, never once said, hey, and by the way, Jesus was single, pretty good model. He never used that. He had the softball, didn't swing. When they talked about prayer, they never said, Jesus prayed a lot. We should pray too. They never even said that. Like they rarely actually said that what would Jesus do question. But what they did is when it came to, hey, look, if somebody's coming at you with violence, I want you to respond non-violently. Romans 12, 1 Peter 2, Book of Revelation. And so I find that fascinating, that the WWJD question from the apostles involves violence almost through and through. So yeah, when you add up all these different things together, then I think that's a much stronger case. So you can't just pull one brick out of the argument. Well, Matthew 5 is about retaliation or whatever. Well, no, you got to take the whole thing cumulatively, and when you do that, I would say you're swimming an uphill battle to try and say Jesus would have allowed violence in this situation or whatever.
The early church had almost a uniform belief about violence.
Yeah.
First, why is it important what the early church thinks?
Yeah, I know, and especially as a conservative evangelical, a lot of people, they want to end at the Book of Revelation. Everything else is irrelevant or Catholic or heresy, And I got some of that pushback, well, the early church believes all kinds of weird stuff. I'm like, all right, yeah, that's true. But when there's, this is another area where maybe I'm less conservative. I think there's a huge value in tradition, and I would even say authority. Maybe not the ultimate authority, but I think our authority from the text is mediated through tradition, whether we want it to be or not. We believe in the Trinity because of Athanasius and Irenaeus and a lot of others mediating that to us. So, I think that the early church, especially the pre-Constantinian church, I think it is important to always ask the question, what did they believe about this and this topic? Not that what they say or what any individual early church father says is going to seal the deal, but when there is widespread agreement, I think that's very significant. They are closer to the original language, closer to the context. A lot of early church fathers, this is just what they did, is study the Bible. It's like they spent more time studying the Bible in manuscripts that may have been copies of copies, rather than copies of copies through several translations. I mean, they are closer to getting it right than we are. So when there is widespread agreement, I think that should be the default answer. And if we're going to disagree with that, we need to work really hard. That's widespread agreement. What I found is near uniform agreement with theologians whose writings we still have, living in different areas of the empire.
Mm.
So we're not talking about just the Alexandrian school or just the the Rome or Western school or just the Caesarea Israel. We're talking Christians who aren't even conversing with each other, who are studying the text. They come up with this conclusion. Oh, way over here studying the text, they come up. They could. That to me, and I don't, because I didn't want the book to be too scholarly. I want it to be more readable. I mentioned that. I don't know how much that soaked in, but that I don't know too many theological issues that had such widespread agreement across different regions as this issue. I don't, maybe the deity of Christ. I don't even know if that. This to the early church was such a no brainer. So I think that chapter is so important. I think it's so important. Is it authoritative? Not really. The text is authoritative, but they're basing their view in the text thoroughly. So to me, honestly, that was one of that sealed the deal for me when I looked upon that.
It's really compelling, and I've said this before on this podcast, but it used to bother me when people would defer to tradition, because what I thought they were saying was, hey, let's keep doing this because we've always done this. But truly what they were saying was, we have, give or take a few hundred years, depending on the text, about 2,000 years separating us from the culture that those writers were writing in. So if we can go back to the early church, they're pretty much still living in the same culture. And so they have a pretty good idea of what Paul meant when he wrote what he did, of what Jesus meant when he said the things he did. They have a pretty good idea because they're living in the same culture for the most part. So we should, it should, you're right. Like it's not authoritative in the same way the scriptures are, but it should carry a good amount of weight with us, it seems.
Yeah, and also one other thing that I brought up in the book that I think is super important is they were endorsing nonviolence in a time when they were being persecuted, and that's huge too. This isn't it's one thing for somebody to live in some podunk country town where the threat of violence is nowhere even near them to say, oh yeah, we should be nonviolent. But these people were living they were going to the stake nonviolently. Like they weren't living in some Disneyland of a world. So for them I think that's extra compelling for them to embrace nonviolence. They must have some serious theological reasons for doing that. And the pushback is the assumption is always, they didn't believe in fighting with the military because of idolatry. And I still hear people quote that as if it's gospel truth, and that sometimes is part of the reason, but there are as I showed in the book, there's way too many statements where they directly connect we should be nonviolent because of Jesus or for theological reasons. It's not because the military is all filled with idols and idolatry, so you can't find the military because of idolatry, and really has nothing to do with nonviolence in per se. That's just not. Again, I don't think that's true at all. It's part of the reason for sure, but it's definitely not the whole reason.
I've also heard too that you look back at the oppression that the Jews were under in Jesus' day, and why didn't Jesus endorse violence? And I've heard that it's because they had no chance of winning because the Roman military might was so great. That just does not seem consistent with the character of Jesus. The guy who multiplies the loaves and fishes can surely win a military battle if he so chooses. Jesus is not that pragmatic, frankly.
I have not. Maybe I came across that argument. Yeah, that'd be a terrible argument. It's bringing nothing of the Old Testament with it. Where by definition, that's how God wins battles, is when it's impossible.
So, you give me a good segue to kind of bring it to the modern day. Because Preston, frankly, for me, the hardest part of being a pacifist is living in the country with the greatest military might ever, and frankly, and benefiting from that, reaping the economic benefits of that. That there's kind of a guilt toward it, that I can speak out about it, but still I'll enjoy the fruits of that, if that makes sense. What do we do with that tension?
I don't know, man. That's in a sense we are, it's not too different for some of the early Christians. I mean, it's our
Because
situation.
they're living under Roman rule, which is an
And
iron fist.
you have wealthy believers. You have, Mary, the mother of John Mark, who's got a massive house, and Priscilla and Aquila have a decent amount of money. You've got, um, what's his name? Gaius. You got evidence of Christians that have wealth, largely because of the success of the Roman Empire, which is driven largely because of violence. So, I mean, I think you do have that tension in Scripture itself, and they don't. We live in a broken world where we have overarching societal evils that we can't change overnight, and there's going to be benefit from that. So yeah, I don't. I'm glad to embrace to be discouraged with you and wrestle with that. I think if we didn't, then we'd be a little inconsistent. But at the same time, I don't think. I don't think that calls for like a removal of us from this country, or don't pay taxes, or let's just whatever. Yeah. But I think it's a good tension to sit with, and I honestly don't know. I mean, how aggressive should the church, in theory, be? That I guess say the nonviolent church, in putting an end to our national violence. I just don't see that. And I don't know. I keep going back and forth on this. I just don't see a huge. I see, as Greg Boyd says, a kind of a steady indifference to the political stuff going on around the world in the first century. That's kind of where I lean. Some people say, yeah, but the prophets, in the Old Testament, called Assyria on the carpet for what they were doing, and they called the whole world to obedience in Jesus. And it wasn't just. Yeah, so I don't know. I wrestle with that. It's you got me there. I would love to think about that with you. If you come up with something better, I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Sure. I think, easy answers to those kind of questions are probably not good ones. Along the same lines, like, how do we as Christians react to and help a suffering world? So, like, when there is, things like the Arab Spring, and people are being murdered and being killed. The stock answer to those things is how we help them by military intervention.
Right.
How can we as privileged Christians help those people, help a suffering world?
Yeah, gosh. I mean, ideally, it would be to go, like Hebrews, go visit them in prison, or Jesus said the same thing, right? I mean, to go and be there with them, or if you can't physically go, there are Christian organizations, missionaries, people who are there. The one I just talked to a guy who, oh shoot, I forgot the name of it. He would love the advertisement. I forgot the name. He's over in Iraq. Love something is organization.
Preemptive Love, Jeremy Courtney.
Yes. Yeah.
Good friend of mine. Jeremy and I went to college together.
Oh, cool. Yeah.
Been on the show, actually. Yeah.
Oh, awesome. Yeah. So something like that, where it's like, okay, maybe we can even as little as supporting them, spreading awareness, information, supporting financially. There are people on the ground, kind of everywhere, that could be the hands and feet of Jesus to a suffering world where violence is caving in on them, and sometimes even our own country is backing that or inflicting it in some capacity. That may be one way. I mean, I don't want to be hypocritical and say we should all go, because realistically I'm probably not going to move to Iraq anytime soon. Just different calling, I guess. In the age of social media and stuff, I mean, even spreading awareness. I mean, actions don't change until thinking changes, and I think spreading awareness and keep pushing on the cognitive side, I think that can actually do a lot. I don't want to be idealistic and say it's going to change the world, but I mean, the whole Arab Spring. I read somewhere that entire thing happened largely because of Twitter. If it wasn't for Twitter, It wouldn't have happened, because of mass communication, and I think worldviews can shift. Or it has to begin with a change of thinking, and that can happen now, day and age. I mean, in today's world, it can happen from people behind a computer, just doing this. I mean, so the more of this, I think that's at least a start.
Well, I don't want to. In the last part of the book, you devote that to talking about a lot of the modern day objections that people come up with. What if somebody is breaking into my house with a gun, threatening my family? What about police police force and that kind of thing? Can a Christian join the military and that kind of stuff?
Yeah.
And I'll just encourage the listeners just to get the book and read up on that part. I think what I want to ask you is a lot of times what we do, or when people raise those objections, they're not so concerned about those actual instances as they are as in poking holes in the ideal. Because what we do, and Greg Boyd has said this before, but we go to those extreme examples and then we say, well, God certainly can't be for that. And so we walk back the nonviolence completely to where we're not for nonviolence at all.
Yeah.
Can you talk about that a little bit?
Yeah, that is, you're spot on there. Those questions, I almost didn't want to address them, but enough people encouraged me, said, look, regardless of the motivation, those are the questions everybody has. And if you don't answer them or address them, they're going to throw the whole book out the window. You know, people that may have been persuaded again by the 95%, they're going to think you're dodging it. And what if this doesn't work in the real world, then, it's not, what are you even talking about? So, the question, the funnest is when you talk about these in a forum in public. Just a couple of weeks ago, I was talking about fight and kind of talking about the book and everything, and then one guy in the audience, it kind of clicked for him, and he kind of looked like he's just shocked. It kind of clicked, and he's like, "We're not actually talking about this, right?" Like, what do you mean? He's like, "We're not actually discussing whether or not we'll defend our family, right? Like that's not what we're talking about, right?" And I'm like, I don't know how to answer that. Yeah, sort of. Yeah, we are talking about it, and he was he just checked out. I mean, it was like he just could not believe that we were having this discussion. Like this was even a question. But then I said, well, let me bring it back. Here's my question. Nobody's breaking in right now, so that this is a theoretical. We're stepping back and asking an ethical question. And my question is, does the New Testament ever endorse the use of violence to defend innocent people? Because before we just blow the guy's head off, he's breaking into our home, rape. It's always rape, right, of daughters. Well, I said let's back up and ask since we're in this nice air conditioning room, we're out in the heat of the battle. We can ask not what would we do, but what should we do? And when we say what should we do, if we're Christian, we have to ask what does the Bible say. So I'm asking, does the New Testament ever advocate for the use of violence to defend innocent people? And in all genuineness, if there, I want to know, like chapter, let's just comb through in Matthew to Revelation, like if it's no, the Bible doesn't, then as Christians who we believe in, Creator breathed out this word, it's inspired and inerrant, all that stuff we love to talk about, then we have, yes, we are talking about that question, If you can give me a chapter, verse, argument, whatever, then let's throw it on the table, we'll talk about it. But if there's no, the Bible doesn't even hint at that, the New Testament, then we got a problem, Houston. I mean, then we need to at least talk about it. So I think when I frame it more in the concrete, does the Bible address, and whenever I raise that, I still have yet to, I don't think I've ever received anybody that countered with an argument that the New Testament does. And I actually think in the book, I even give kind of the lesser of two evils. And I say, look, I'll do it for you. I will give you what I say is the best argument. I think it has holes in it. And I think the absolute nonviolent position has more biblical backing, but I'll even spoon feed you,
play devil's advocate.
Yeah, New Testament. But even then, if I didn't, I have not had people return with a solid, well thought out argument that says, yes, because of this, and this, the Bible advocates for the use of violence by the hands of Christians to defend innocent people. So all those scenarios, Yoder has a great, is it Yoder? Or maybe there's another book that, when people create these sort of perfect scenarios, guys breaking in, he's going to kill your family. I'm like, well, why is he going to kill your family? Because statistically, unless you're involved in gangs or drugs or you've done something to him, like that's 0.00001 that somebody just says, hey, I'm going to go kill a family. Like that. And then I said, well, what about you're going to blow his head off? Okay, so you must be a really good shot.
Yeah.
Somebody shot. Well, why don't you just shoot the gun out of his hand? If you're going to do, cowboy up and blah, blah, blah. I mean, how do you know? If I've got guns and I actually am a pretty good shot, I would be so scared to blow my kid's head off. Yeah. Where's he standing in your perfect scenario? Yeah. Is he behind you? You're like this, and they're not upstairs playing, or they're not outside the real world. My kids are all over the place. They're not just standing behind me as people break.
Right.
Bullets in the gun. Yeah, bullets in the gun in the house with kids. let's talk about that, because the
Yeah.
risk of that is actually much, so I don't, they don't like when I do that, but in a sense, I don't, I think it's, as you said, and this, extremely unfair with that question for somebody to create this fictitious scenario where they get to make up all the rules and I don't get to make up any rules.
Right.
Position, like, I want to make up some rules here, or so, yeah, that absolutely, yeah.
Well, I think, statistically, maybe that's happened once, that perfect scenario. But the thing to me is, I feel like that's what Paul was talking about when he's saying, like, if Christ wasn't raised from the dead, we should be pitied among everyone. And it's kind of like he's saying, like, look, we're gonna like suffer for our belief, and if we're wrong at the end of all this, if we die and there's just nothing, then we should be pitied among everyone. Yeah. But he's almost like, if I'm wrong, I'm gonna be wrong all the way. Like, it goes back to that consistency thing that we're talking about. Like, if I'm wrong about this, then man, I'm gonna go down like, swinging. What a horrible metaphor for what we're talking about. But I'm gonna be wrong completely all the way, and that it goes back to what we're talking about with the consistency, with when people see we believe in nonviolence when we're talking about abortion, or when we're talking about those things. But when it comes to things that have to do with our pocketbooks, like the military, or right-wing causes like capital punishment, we draw back, and we're not consistent with the scripture. And so I feel like that's what it's talking about. Like, let's be wrong all the way if we're wrong, and we don't think we are, so we're only accountable to God and the resurrected Christ. So why don't we follow through with what we say we believe?
Yeah, that's good. Yeah, the resurrection. I mean, I will say the biggest payoff I've had in context audiences where they wouldn't naturally want to embrace this at all, when I start talking about the resurrection and talking about the greater Christian worldview that we have and how this fits in, how we have a non-flesh and blood enemy, and do we fight against evil? Absolutely. But our evil that we're fighting against, you can't shoot. You can nuke we can destroy. Choose your death method, a nuke, electric chair, whatever, every single terrorist in the world, and Satan's going to be sitting back in his lazy boy saying, nice try. That doesn't,
right.
You can't, that's not the evil we're fighting against. And I think most people, when I say that, there's too many verses, Ephesians 6, they grew up with, like, they're like, oh, okay, yeah, I can kind of, like it starts to make sense a little bit. I think that's, you look at, the resurrection changes everything in creation, changes everything in our thinking, and we need to look at this question through the lens of the resurrection. And I think people kind of get that. They may not agree with me all the way, but like, okay, I can see where you're coming from now.
Yeah. Preston, it's been so great having you, and the book is so fantastic. I'll have links to it on the show notes for the listeners, and also to your website and all that good stuff.
Awesome.
Man, thank you so much. And is there anything you want to leave with us before we go?
No, I'm good. I will. Let me just give a little plug to my school. Anybody listening, Eternity Bible College. We're committed to affordability. It's, I think, the cheapest college around, and our entire program is online, distance education. You can get an entire 4-year degree from your living room chair, and all sorts of other resources. So check out Eternity Bible College. It's a great place.
Awesome, yeah. And y'all, and Eternity's in LA, but obviously don't need to be there because you can do it online.
And I'm actually moving. This is why I'm moving. I'm moving to Boise, Idaho.
Whoa.
To plant an extension site. So I'm moving up in 3 weeks, and in fall 2015, we'll be launching classes in Boise, Idaho. You probably don't have too many listeners in Idaho.
You never know.
But yeah, that's what we're doing. So we want to provide affordable, rigorous theological education to anybody, and we don't want anybody to say, I can't do this because of ... No, we made it accessible to everybody. So
fantastic. Yeah. Preston, thanks for joining me.
My pleasure, Shane. It's great talking to you.
Love that book. Love that conversation with Preston. It was so good. Loved everything he had to say. Remember, I'll have a link to the book and Preston's blog on the show notes for this show. You can go to shaneblackshear.com/Preston Sprinkle. And also you can always find all episodes at seminarydropout.com. Remember that. Hey, I want to thank those who have given ratings and reviews and subscribed to Seminary Dropout in iTunes lately. Most recently, Thistlefer. I think I might be saying that screen name correctly. Thank you so much for your review on iTunes. And also PGH Sports Guy. Thank you too. So nice to have those reviews on iTunes. And please, if you've not gone and subscribed and rated and reviewed on iTunes, remember that helps the show so much. So please go and do that. I would greatly appreciate it. All right. I think that's all I have for you this week. Remember, join us next week for another great episode of Seminary Dropout, and I'll see you all later. Take care.